Phil. Do you remember having to do those essays at school where you had to compare and contrast? You know, it seemed to be English we did it in most. Compare and contrast two different poets' take on a similar subject. And you had that. We had this anthology and we had to flick through and colour it in. Compare and contrast two characters' reactions in a Shakespeare play. Compare and contrast how the language has changed in two books written at different periods. A good compare and contrast. You know, there's a reason they make you do it at school. It is a worthwhile exercise. It can help you appreciate a work of art or a character in a story all the more. You know, compare and contrast Macbeth with Macduff, and you see how honesty and faithfulness, despite loss, ultimately lead to a better end than treachery and murder. Compare and contrast Romeo and Juliet. It's always Shakespeare. It's always Shakespeare. Compare and contrast Romeo and Juliet with the book of the Song of Songs, and you can understand perfectly the dangerous passions behind romantic love. Compare and contrast Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice with a film like Schindler's List, and you can see the ways in which attitudes towards Jewish people have and haven't changed in 500 years of European history. We're going to look at the account of Jesus' arrest and trial in John 18 that Phil read for us through the lens of three compare and contrast, or it's 3.5 really, because I've added a secret one at the end. Three compare and contrast. Remember that John's purpose in writing this gospel is to show people that Jesus is the Messiah so that they will believe in him. It's not just about showing us Jesus is the Messiah so that we'll believe that that is true, but so that we will believe in him. Through comparing and contrasting the Son of Man with others, I hope that we'll see more clearly just who Jesus is and why he is worthy to be trusted. Firstly then, Jesus and the fishermen. Now, if this were an essay question, you don't have to do homework. It would say, compare and contrast Jesus of Nazareth with Simon Peter of Capernaum. Well, Simon Peter, like I think we all know, was a lively character. If there's one of the disciples who need to declare how or who Jesus is or how worthy he is, Peter is always at the front of the queue. Similarly, if one of the disciples is going to put their foot in their mouth and say something really stupid, Peter's usually, not always, you know, Philip and Thomas will give him a run for his money, but he's usually at the front of the queue. Back in 1337, in this gospel, Peter said boldly how he would lay down his life for Jesus. So, you know, even if all the others abandon you, I'll die for you. And in verse 10 here, it seems initially as if he's willing to do exactly that. As the soldiers come into the garden to arrest Jesus, Peter leaps up, sword in hand, and he attacks the first person in reach. He had zeal, but not knowledge. For 3 years, Jesus had been teaching the disciples a better way. Not a way of violence, but a way of love. Not a way of acting violently on our own initiative, but in trusting God even when we are acted violently upon. For 3 years, and especially for the past few hours, the past evening, Jesus has been explaining to his disciples how he had to be arrested and killed. In his anger, perhaps in his fear, in the heat of his passion, Simon seems to have forgotten all that. And he disobeys his master violently. Now, if you're the kind of person like Peter who experiences big emotions, now be aware of how they can easily spin you into saying or doing the wrong thing, even when you think it is exactly the opposite thing to what you ought to do in that situation, or when you've got a clear head you think you would do in that situation. Just a short while later, from verse 15 onwards, Peter denies Jesus, just as Jesus had foretold. So he's gone from not just not laying down his life for Jesus, but he won't even acknowledge that Jesus is his master. In this time, it was apparently socially acceptable, perfectly socially acceptable, to deny your Jewishness if it was to protect your life. You know, so you think of a film like Schindler's List and the atrocities of the Nazis during what we call the Holocaust. Interestingly, Jewish people don't call it the Holocaust. They don't like that word. But during that time period, and if you were Jewish, Jewish people wouldn't have had a problem, even then, in the ancient world either, with just pretending like you weren't Jewish if someone came around threatening to kill you for being Jewish. They showed that level of practical wisdom. But while, whether then or now, it might have been okay to deny being Jewish, it was a shameful thing to deny your rabbi. It was humiliating for a rabbi to not be acknowledged by a disciple. And yet, 3 times, as his character blew hot and cold, Peter denied knowing, and more significantly, denied being a follower of Jesus. Now, I've given him a few gut punches, I suppose, but we're not here tonight to beat up Peter. Now, if we're honest, we can all sympathize with that temptation, the temptation to deny Jesus with our words or our actions, to disobey him in thought or practice. And in Peter's defense, he could not help but go to where Jesus was, could he? He was afraid. He denied the law, but he went. He was there. He had that much courage. But compare and contrast Peter's denial and disobedience with the calm, collected obedience of Jesus. He went to a garden where he knew his betrayer could find him. Verse 2. Judas knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. He could have gone somewhere else. He could have gone somewhere that he knew Judas wouldn't expect. But he goes to the exact place that he knows Judas will find him. He goes out to meet the party that was coming to arrest him. And it was dark by that point. Maybe not that dark because of the moon, but he could have legged it, couldn't he? He could have gone over the wall. He could have escaped, and it would have probably been fairly easy. But he goes out to meet the people coming to arrest him. With great power, in clear demonstration of his divine nature and authority. We could talk about that when we're having a coffee afterwards. I've got some brackets written around the word in verse 8. Ask me about it later. But he owns up to who he was, verse 5. He could have denied it. It would have been Judas's word against him, and Judas has already shown himself to be a fairly unreliable character, so, who's to say? But Jesus admits that he is Jesus of Nazareth. Despite, in all of these things, putting himself in the way of this arrest, knowing all that was going to happen to him. When it looks like everything's going to descend into a bloody fight as Peter leaps to his defense, swinging wildly with his sword, instead of calling down the armies of angels that were his to command, Jesus commands his errant disciple to sheathe his sword. Shall I not drink the cup my Father has given me? The fisherman's faithlessness in the face of his possible arrest shows us all the more clearly Jesus' faithfulness. Even though he knows this cup he has to drink to its dregs is the cup of God's anger against every sin of his people. Compare and contrast Jesus of Nazareth with Simon Peter of Capernaum. Peter repeatedly pursues his own will, as do we all. Jesus prays to the Father, not my will, but yours be done. Well, secondly, let's look at Jesus and the high priest. Compare and contrast Jesus of Nazareth with Annas, the high priest. Annas had become high priest apparently in the year 6 AD. Probably, when Jesus was just a young boy. He'd been deposed by the Romans less than 10 years later, but for the Jews, this was a position that you held for life. If you think back to the Pentateuch, if you've done that in a reading plan, and when you go to a city of refuge, you stay there until the death of the high priest. So it was understood to be a position that was held for life, and that's why he's often referred to as the high priest, just as his son-in-law Caiaphas is, even if Caiaphas is the high priest that the Romans recognize at that particular year. And Annas is a bit like a medieval pope or a mafia godfather. This is why Jesus is taken before him first. His is the voice that counts in the Jewish council. He's the power behind the scenes, the power behind the throne. And of course, as you see this interaction, Annas probably has all manner of religious or theological reasons for disliking Jesus. He's not, it's not in a way petty. He's not just taken against him because he doesn't like the cut of his jib. He sees Jesus as a blasphemer. But as with Caiaphas, he's like an ugly mirror image of Annas. It seems that their real problem with Jesus, for all his perceived blasphemy, it's the political uproar that he might cause by going around claiming to be the Messiah. The statement referred to in verse 14 that he'd advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. It was referred back in chapter 11. Now, if we let him go on like this in 1148, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. That their hatred of Jesus is principally political is proven, I think, by just how underhanded they are about this whole thing. From the beginning of their opposition, the Jewish leaders under Annas' rule have tried to catch Jesus out with spies and with trick questions. Now, afraid of the people, they've debated in back rooms and secret councils. Rather than discuss the word of God in public, they've decided amongst themselves to put Jesus to death. They've already got the verdict they want. They're not worried or concerned about due process here. They're just wondering about the best way to implement it. They've already decided Jesus needs to go. They just, how can we best make that happen? They don't care about the truth. Do you notice that? They don't seem to be concerned about the possibility that Jesus' apparently blasphemous claims might be true. What man could do the things Jesus did? What sinner could do what Jesus did? They don't seem interested in that. They care about political expediency. Now, I think it's easy sometimes to feel that same party political motivation, that tribal feeling when we react against a Bible teacher. Maybe it's a book you hear or someone, you're away at another church, you hear someone preach, and you kind of have this gut reaction against something they say. And I don't know, are they really always teaching something opposed to what the Bible teaches? Or are they just putting things forward from a perspective that doesn't fit with our particular tradition or the language that we're used to using? I think us evangelicals can be a little too prone to a knee-jerk reaction of things when it's not in our language or it's just not what we're used to hearing. And we're not careful enough to consult what is the truth. We're not afraid of truth. We shouldn't be afraid of truth. Truth is God's truth, and it's always going to be good truth. Contrast this with much of the way that Jesus is arrested and tried here, in definite contravention of Jewish law. What kind of trial takes place at 1 a.m? A trial with a risk of the death penalty had to be, according to their law, had to be conducted during the day. What Jewish court asked someone to accuse themselves? That was illegal. So was striking a defendant without sentence having been passed. It's like you're not allowed to flog someone until they've been condemned as guilty. You just can't do it. Yet all of this happens. I mean, what kind of judge trying a rabbi asks him about his disciples before he asks about the truth of what he teaches? It's just politics. That's all they're concerned about. But compare and contrast this with what Jesus declares of himself. And if you look at verse 20 onwards, I've underlined the I's. When Jesus says I've underlined it because you just think, compared to what they're doing, hear what Jesus says. I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I, and you can hear as opposed to you, said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. You're asking me to condemn myself by my own words, and you could confirm all this. You're just trying to pretend like this is a real court. Jesus had no secret agenda. He spoke and taught openly. His manner was direct. He didn't teach rhetoric. He didn't teach sophistry or pointless philosophy. He didn't teach politics. He taught the truth of the Bible, the truth of God, unfiltered. What you saw was what you got. The Jewish leaders, Annas, the high priest, were willing to break every law they were supposed to uphold to maintain the status quo. Jesus was willing to be treated as a lawbreaker, even though he, unlike every other person who has ever lived, never committed a single sin and kept the law of God perfectly. Well, thirdly, Jesus and the governor. Compare and contrast Jesus of Nazareth with Pontius Pilate. Now, for all his secret power, Annas isn't able to legally put Jesus to death. Now, no doubt the Jews could have just lynched Jesus the way they later lynch Stephen in the book of Acts. But they don't just want Jesus dead. That's not enough for them. They need Jesus humiliated. They don't just want to kill him. They think that might just make a martyr of him. They want to discredit him. There's no clearer sign of that for all the Jewish people who will be watching these actions than if they can have him crucified. Hung on a tree in a way that proves to any Jewish person who knows the Bible that he has been cursed by God. And if he's been cursed by God, well, he can't be the Messiah then, can he? Pontius Pilate, he was another interesting character. He made repeated blunders with the Jews, and he seems to have despised them. Anti-Semitism in fancy uniforms doesn't start in the 20th century. It goes a long way back. He sparked riots when his soldiers had brought icons of the emperor into Jerusalem. He took money from the temple to build an aqueduct. Luke 13 tells of a sacrilegious atrocity that he conducted against either pilgrims or temple worshippers. You remember, that he mixed their blood with the blood of the sacrifices. That's kind of the sort of the poetic description, if you like, of the violence that he did against these people, if you like, almost going to church. He would use whatever mix of violence, diplomacy, or corruption would achieve the ends he wanted. It would be nothing for him to condemn an innocent man to a torturous death, even if it was kind of personally distasteful, as long as it preserved the peace in Judea and, more importantly, didn't lead to any bad reports about him making their way back to Caesar. According to the historian Josephus, Pilate's career ended in shame when the emperor called him back to Rome for his mismanagement of the province, and apparently he killed himself. But here, he's still the Roman governor. This is before all that. He's the man with a real, at least legal power in Jerusalem. And you look at how he's kind of perplexed and amused when he meets Jesus. He doesn't seem to know quite what to make of the whole situation. Are you the King of the Jews? Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. It's like he thinks it's absurd that the Jews, who are famous of their hatred of Roman rule, they're demanding he kills a man they say claims to be their king. It's like the exact opposite of what he would expect. It's like, if you're this sort of big religious leader, how come all the religious leaders have handed you over to me? What is it that you've done? Like, what have you done to get these Jews so riled up? And when Jesus starts to talk about truth, if you look at verse 37 and verse 38, when Jesus starts to talk about truth, Pilate seems to just immediately dismiss him as a philosopher or a religious leader. And he's not someone worthy of judicial punishment. It's like Pilate's just immediately just not interested in it anymore. And like so many before and so many since, Pilate seals his own fate by a complete disinterest in truth. Now compare him to Jesus. Now Pilate has worldly political authority, but he exercises it pragmatically out of fear of the Jews and the report that they might pass on to Caesar. Like, they'll get in trouble with the boss if they send a mean letter about him. The man with all the apparent power seems impotent compared to a homeless Galilean carpenter who is in complete control of this conversation. Jesus cuts through the obscuring cloud of politics and he goes straight for the jugular. He goes straight for the truth. He admits that he's the king of a spiritual kingdom. And he lays out an offer to listen and believe that Pilate, to his eternal loss, refuses. One man, Pilate, is completely unconcerned with truth unless it can benefit his own career. And he's willing to oversee a travesty of justice if it serves his political interests. The other man isn't just interested in the truth. He is the way and the truth and the life. For the joy set before him, he will endure the cross, scorning its shame. A final quick bonus comparison we could make is the one that Pilate offers the crowd. Now, it was the custom, like he says, to pardon the criminal at the feast. Religious expectancy in Jerusalem will be pretty high once you've got everyone returned to celebrate Passover. This what we're going to think about next Sunday morning, this famous act of liberation for Jewish people, and they're all celebrating it here while living under a foreign occupying power. And so you can understand, all right, well, let's release a criminal and then we'll just calm things down a bit. everyone's getting a bit wound up. We'll release a few hostages and just, take the kettle off the boil a little bit. And probably as a way of getting rid of this whole case that he finds so unpalatable, Pilate wants to wash his hands, if you'll pardon the pun, of the whole thing. So he offers two candidates for pardon: Jesus or a known murderer named Barabbas. He's a highwayman or a terrorist. He's taken part in an uprising. Perhaps in the face of these two polar opposites, he expects the crowd, even those who don't really like Jesus, to choose him to be pardoned, because obviously he's the better one than Barabbas. Once again, Pilate shows himself to have no grasp of the nature of Jewish religion or the custom and culture of that time. Given the choice of a murderer or the creator of the world, the crowd choose the murderer. Their rejection of Jesus is so deep-seated, so profound, they'd rather a scoundrel and a villain go free than for a man this governor has just declared is innocent of any crime deserving death. And isn't that what we're all like, apart from the grace of God? We've seen who Jesus is through these comparisons. And yet, left to our own devices, we would all side with murder, death, and destruction, rather than acknowledge that Jesus is Lord over us. John wrote this gospel so that you could hear about Jesus, believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, and by believing have life in his name. Was there a man like Jesus, someone who would obey his Father whatever the cost, someone who, in the face of such unrighteousness, would uphold all righteousness, a king who would submit himself to injustice so that his people could live forever. Do you believe? Isn't Jesus worth trusting? Isn't he, and he alone, a man worth dedicating your life to? Compare and contrast what the world can give you to keep with what Jesus offers everyone who trusts in his name. Let's sing our final hymn, number 600.